right. So, hello, Kevin. Could you please introduce yourself and what you do?
Hey, I'm Kevin Owocki. I'm one of the co-founders of Gitcoin, and Gitcoin itself has delivered about $63 million worth of funding to open source software and other public goods in the Ethereum ecosystem. Presently focused on evolving Gitcoin to become multi-mechanism, going from quadratic funding, which is the mechanism that Gitcoin is traditionally been known for, to now doing retro funding and possibly other mechanisms from there. So yeah, evolving Gitcoin into the field of on-chain capital allocation, and recently just wrote a book called the On-Chain Capital Allocation Handbook, a journey from present mechanisms to future possibilities. So kind of think of myself as an explorer of the design space, but also trying to build an institution while we're at it. So glad to be here. It's been good to work with you, Ciro, and looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And yeah, a lot of the people that I've spoken to on this podcast have actually greatly benefited from Gitcoin and what you guys have been doing over the last, how long has it been? I've known about it for like 5 years.
Yeah, I started Gitcoin in 2017, and so it's been about 7 years. We're recording this in September. Actually, no, it's October of 2024. So it's been about 7 years now.
And when I first got introduced to Gitcoin, it was a bounty platform, at least to a certain degree. I'm sure you guys did a lot of different things, but it's significantly changed, in my opinion, from then. Could you talk a bit about the history of Gitcoin? Like, what was the idea that spawned it, and what have the last 7 years been like?
Yeah, well, Gitcoin has evolved a bit over the last 7 years. I originally started Gitcoin because I wanted a better way to recruit I wanted a better way to recruit engineers to work on my projects. In Web 2, I had a long career as both an individual contributor, but also sometimes as a CTO, VP engineering type of everything from small teams of one or two people all the way up to 25 people. And so through that time, I spent a lot of time recruiting software engineers, and I wanted a better way to recruit. I also wanted to find a way to give back to open source software from which I had gotten so much value. Open source software produces so much value in the form of web servers and database servers and programming tools that we all use to assemble websites from, and I wanted to find a way to give back to open source software. And so I started Gitcoin in 2017 with the mission of pushing open source forward. And we initially launched as a bounty platform where open source software developers could get paid for doing bounties. In hindsight, that mission was horribly huge, and the mechanism of bounties was just really naive in terms of funding open source software. So we went multi-mechanism, launched bounties, we launched grants, we had a ethical ad network called Code Fund for a number of years, and the mission also evolved. Evolved from pushing open source forward to growing open source, which reflected are learning that open source didn't really need a push. It was more like a garden that you were growing. So we went from push open source forward to grow open source. And then in 2020, we evolved the mission from grow open source to build and fund the open web, which was sort of a recognition that we were at that point funding COVID recovery and community and education and a bunch of stuff that wasn't just strictly open source software. And then from then, 2 years ago, we actually went through a mission, adjustment that went from build and fund the open web to just become fund what matters. So went from just build and fund the open web to fund what matters, which was, in my opinion, a little bit more elegant way of saying, hey, if something matters to a community, then that's what we should be funding, and moving away to sort of like the dogmatism around this is a public good or this isn't a public good that was reflected in our own mission. So, yeah, I think of Gitcoin as a series of ebbs and flows over the last 7 years, starting with push open source forward to grow open source to build and fund the open web, and then now fund what matters as the mission statement. And the mechanisms over the years have evolved from bounties to hackathons to now grants is pretty much all we do. And, there's different subsets of mechanisms within grants. Originally, we were quadratic funding. Now we're doing retro funding. We're doing direct grants. We're doing a bunch of other different types of ways to fund what matters out there. And so there's been this sort of push and pull between the mission and how we state it versus the mechanisms that we employ to achieve the mission. And all in all, if you go to impact.gitcoin.co, you can see that we've delivered $63 million worth of funding to the Ethereum ecosystem. So it's been a lot of fun. It's been a journey, but just the beginnings in some ways. I hope to see us have 10x more impact over the next 10 years or so. But yeah, that's the journey. Let me know if you want to dive in on any specific spot.
So I would love to talk about the future of Gitcoin and what you guys could do to expand the horizons beyond just like crypto or Web3. But before we do that, the bounty system is actually a very personal thing for me. That's how I got started in this ecosystem. I was a web developer and I started actually in sales, and I wanted to get into the tech industry, and I started learning how to code through an open source platform called the Odin Project, which was founded by another founder, the person who founded Near Protocol. So I studied that for a few years, and like the tech industry right now over the last, I think, 6, 7 years has been very difficult to get into, but bounties were such an easy to bite off chunk. It wasn't a huge investment from the organization's point of view. It wasn't a huge investment on my end, and I could tackle smaller projects. And I started getting into that, and that has led to the career that I have now, which I'm very grateful for. You mentioned that that was a naive idea at the start, like tackling this through bounties. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Happy to get into that. Just before I clarify, or before I comment on that, was it bounties on Gitcoin that was part of your journey, or just bounties in general that pulled you down
So
the rabbit hole?
it was bounties in general, but I have gone through bounties on Gitcoin as well.
Cool. Yeah, I just always love one of my favorite parts of this job is seeing people at hackathons or people DMing me and saying, "Hey, Gitcoin changed the trajectory of my career in X and Y and Z way." And so, regardless of whether it was Gitcoin bounties or bounties in general, I always like to hear stories about how Gitcoin's tools and products have affected the course of the way people think about crypto or just like got them through a rough patch through of funding. But yeah, anyway, so specifically to answer your question, bounties, I think I called bounties naive, and you wanted me to respond to that. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Great. So yeah, bounties were the product that we launched with in 2017. And what I think is really great about the bounty mechanism is that it's a way for people to get coins on Gitcoin. So basically, if you do X, you will get Y coins. And I think that that's really elegant. It's like a really old primitive. If you look back to the history of civilization, these sort of bounties where if you do X, then you get paid for it. So kind of like a milestone based payout kind of thing. And I think it's really elegant for its simplicity. What I meant about bounties being a naive mechanism is relative to the whole of open source software. Remember, at this time, our mission is to grow open source. And, there was a study commissioned in I think it was 2011 that said that $400 billion per year in economic value is created by open source software. I think exactly the exact number is 387 billion. But again, this is 15 years old, so it's certainly grown a lot by then. That represents just a colossal amount of economic value. When I want to start a website, I don't make my own web server. I don't make my own database server. I use Nginx and I use Postgres. And if I need a NoSQL database, then I use Redis. And I just think that the intellectual capital that that represents is humongous. And so when I said that bounties are naive way of accomplishing that mission, I didn't mean that they're not good for different things. I just meant that in terms of our mission of growing open source software, bounties are sort of a naive way of solving that problem of supporting open source maintainers. A, because a lot of open source maintainers are not going to do bounty work for people who have money. And if they did, I think that that would be relatively plutocratic. I also think that people want the stability of having recurring income as they're producing value for open source software. And it's also just not a very good business for Gitcoin to be in because running a bounty site is kind of like running a dating site. Like we're basically after you make the introduction between the party and their counterparty, they take the relationship off platform, and so you need a continued ongoing source of bounties over time. And so I think that every tool is different in some ways in how it can be used, but bounties are a really powerful primitive. They're just naive if you're going to try to fund all of open source software just with bounties. And again, open source creates $400 billion per year in economic value. And I found that a lot of the open source maintainers that I was meeting didn't like bounties because it felt more like gig work to them, whereas they wanted ongoing money, recurring money for the work that they were already doing. And that was kind of part of why we pivoted from bounties to grants in the 2019 cycle. So yeah, bounties are still a powerful primitive, but Gitcoin is no longer really in the bounties business.
That makes sense. I understand it more when you frame it like that. Uh, and not to harp on this too long, it's just more so sharing my personal experience. I think that there is a huge portion of the developer landscape that could be easily captured and onboarded into the space if there was a way for them to quickly jump in, do something, and then learn all of these tools that, proliferate. So, but to go and look towards the future, I read My Coffee, and I'm not sure exactly the dynamics, but I know there were multiple authors, and I think that you were the publisher or the orchestrator. Um, but you talked about the different funding mechanisms that you've seen in the open source ecosystem in the Web3 space. Some of that being quadratic funding, grants, retro, and how are you seeing things right now, and what do you think the future of these different types of funding mechanisms looks like?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to introduce the MycoFi book to the author since you invoked it. You're talking about the book about mycelial finance that we released, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Cool. So if you go to mycofi.art, mycofi.art, you'll see the book that we released at ETH Denver in 2024. And basically, the idea set here is mycelial design patterns for Web3 and beyond. What is mycelium? Mycelium is the root network beneath mushrooms, and it's basically nature's oldest peer-to-peer network. So you think about mushrooms, and once you realize that mycelium, the underground part of the organism, is actually 80 or 90% of its mass, and the fruit is just the mushroom is just like the fruit or like the flower of that. And basically, the idea behind MycoFi was what can we learn from nature's oldest peer to peer network about how to design patterns of Web3 economies? And we came up with six principles, myself and the other co-authors. Jeff Emmett from Block Science was one of the primary authors on the project. And he came up with this idea of network infrastructure, fractal nature, emergent coordination, dynamic flow, mutual reciprocity, and polycentric pluralism as the principles of mycelium that exist in nature that we should apply to Web3 economies. And so, yeah, the MycoFi book, I was just the producer of it. But I was talking to Jeff Emmett about what Web3 has to learn from mushrooms, and he like blew my brain several times in the course of that conversation. I was like, dude, you got to turn this into a book so that other people can learn about it. And that was what was behind the MycoFi book. And the listener can get MycoFi the book for free at mycofi.art, mycofi.art. And that was a fun project to get out there. And I think those six principles that I mentioned are sort of a key to the answer to your question, which maybe you can restate the question or re-give me the prompt, but basically, I think that if we're going to build peer-to-peer networks digitally, then we could learn from the original peer-to-peer network on Earth, which is Mycelium.
Yeah, that was an incredible read. Very visual, very like visually
Yep.
stunning. I enjoyed it a lot. Um, so I see that Gitcoin currently is in a in a sense, modularizing all of these different funding mechanisms and allowing different organizations to access like retro funding or quadratic funding. And I'd like to know, do you see that these funding mechanisms have any space to evolve, or are they basically meant to be a base layer for other organizations to come and innovate on?
Yeah, great question. So basically, um, I built the original Gitcoin wrong. I built it as a large centralized monolith. I mean, in 2019, well, excuse me, 2017, when Gitcoin was invented, we really didn't know as much as we did about how to build modular peer-to-peer networks back then. And, like L2s didn't even exist back then. But basically, I've seen the light, and now I'm into modular and super modular systems. And we have reconfigured Gitcoin to no longer be a company, to be a DAO. There are still aspects of the company that exist, but progressive decentralization in the fullness of time. The hope is to eventually fully make it into a DAO. And basically, Gitcoin's product suite, which used to be centralized and monolithic, we've now rebuilt to be decentralized and modular. What does that mean? So basically, that means that we have decomposed the product into its composite parts, and there are now tools that other developers can fork and use in their ecosystems. So the name of Gitcoin's protocol is called Allo Protocol. That stands for capital allocation. Allocation is just the process of deciding where resources go. Every time you pay a bill or you send money to someone, you are allocating resources. And capital allocation can be a decision that you sort of make from day to day, but in as more and more people get involved and as more money gets involved, capital allocation becomes a full-time job. Governments and venture capitalists spend their time full-time doing capital allocation, and their decisions are existential for the constituents that they serve. And I have a hypothesis that Web3 is going to completely change how we do capital allocation, similar to how the internet changed how we send information across networks. I think on-chain primitives are going to change how we do capital allocation. And so Gitcoin's Allo protocol is designed not only to be the next version of Gitcoin's ecosystem, but also to give people who are building funding infrastructure, that are building capital allocation tools, to get them to start on third base with all of the learnings and lessons and boilerplate code that Gitcoin has developed over its 7 years of existence. So you can check out Allo protocol at allo.gitcoin.co, and the composite parts of that tooling ecosystem that you need to know about are the Allo registry, which is just basically a metadata registry of different projects that can be in a grant round. And then there's the Allo strategy, which is basically it's the brains of the operation. If Allo registry is the heart, it's the list of the projects that are doing good stuff in your ecosystem. The Allo strategy is the brains of the operation. Allo strategy is a way of allocating capital to the projects that are on the registry. And the third component that we're working on is called Allokit, which is basically a way of taking a registry and taking a strategy and spinning up a nice web front end for your funding ecosystem. So basically what we're trying to do, I'd say, is similar to what Open Zeppelin did for launching an ERC20 or an ERC721, we're trying to do for building funding infrastructure. What does that mean? If you're a hacker, if you're a developer, then if you've gone to a hackathon and you're going to build whatever in Web3, you can bring these beautiful components of ERC20 tokens or ERC721 tokens that are well documented and are audited, and you can just pull them down for free into your code repository and get back to building whatever you're going to be building. So you're not reinventing the wheel around ERC20 when you're in a hackathon. We want to do the same thing for capital allocation. So basically, if you need a registry of projects you want to put into your app, you pull down the Allo registry, and it's already well documented. It's already, it's secure because it's been audited. You can pull down an Allo strategy. There are strategies for quadratic funding, for quadratic voting, for retroactive funding. You can pull that into your app. And the Allo strategy will be the capital allocation tool that can form the heart of whatever funding infrastructure you're building. And then Allokit is just an easy way to build a web app around those other Allo components. So basically, we're trying to do what OpenZeppelin did for your C20s, we want to do for funding infrastructure, which is just give you these out of the box, well documented, well maintained components for other people to go and innovate in the field of capital allocation. And there's just so much cool stuff that you can do in capital allocation on chain. Gitcoin Grants is known primarily for quadratic funding. I can go into why that's powerful if you're interested, but we've learned that there's so much more than quadratic funding out there in terms of how we allocate capital. Retroactive funding, conviction voting, grant ships, impact stream. There's a bunch of stuff that's been built on top of Allo, and I'm really looking forward to seeing hundreds or thousands of experiments blossom. And I think that the way that we allocate capital is going to completely change as we go on chain in the coming decade. So yeah, that's Allo Protocol. Allo Protocol is at allo.gitcoin.co if anyone wants to check it out. I
I'm
forgot
gonna
what
leave
question.
all of the links in the description. No, you answered the
Cool.
question. So you talked about the different strategies. Specifically, I want to go into quadratic funding because so I again got introduced to Gitcoin around 2019, maybe a little earlier, and at the time it was still on the bounty. At least that was the main thing that I noticed was the bounty system. But over the last few years, quadratic funding has like caught on. A lot of people are using it. A lot of people are interested in it, and I'd like you to answer two things. So one is what was the inspiration behind it? And then two is, well, first explain what it is and then maybe talk about what the inspiration behind it was.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Quadratic funding is a way to supercharge the small donors in your ecosystem. So basically, how does quadratic funding work? Basically, if you're the Ethereum Foundation or if you're at the heart of any ecosystem, you can set a pool of money that we call the matching pool. Typically, Gitcoin Grants does this once per quarter. We have a matching pool of about $1 million that we set out for people who are running open source software projects or community and education projects in the Web3 ecosystem. And what we do is we allow people to sign up for Gitcoin Grants and to submit their project that they're working on in the registry. Your project can be anything from I'm Preston Van Loon and I'm working on Prismatic Labs, which is a ETH consensus client, to someone who's doing community education in the global south for Web3 and anything in between. Anything that's having a positive impact on the world, you can sign up for a Gitcoin grant round for. Okay, so step one is matching pool. Step two is projects sign up. And then step three is the matching campaign. So basically, during the 2 weeks per quarter that Gitcoin Grants runs, it's quadratic funding round. Contributions from the crowd will be matched from the central matching pool. So you got $1 million matching pool, and we're matching contributions for the crowd, which means that if you're giving to your everyday favorite public goods or open source projects, that your contributions will be matched. Okay, so pretty plain vanilla so far. It's just a matching campaign, TLDR. But there's a one weird trick with quadratic funding that makes it into a funding power tool. And that's that the matching contributions come from the quadratic funding formula, which was invented by Vitalik Buterin and Zoe Hitzig and Glenn Weil. They're the inventors of the mechanisms. I'm just the implementer of it. And basically, the way quadratic funding works is really very elegant. What it does is it matches more on the basis of the number of contributors to your project, not the amount that they've funded. Okay, so that's actually really profound because, Ciro, if you raise a project with $100 from 100 contributors and I raise $100 from one contributor, you get 99% of the matching pool. Okay, so we've got a matching campaign that elevates the preferences of the poor and the many in the ecosystem over the rich and the few. So we've upended a law of economic gravity that says that power's always got to concentrate in the hands of the rich and the few with this mechanism, which is really cool. The other cool thing about quadratic funding is that if a project is popular enough, then a dollar contribution to it can be worth $10, $100, even $1,000 worth of matching, because the matching amount is based more on the number of people that contributed to it rather than the amount that they funded. In Gitcoin grants round 15, which was about 2 or 3 years ago, I remember that Coin Center, which is, they're a Web3 lobbyist in Washington that helps educate policymakers about Web3. They had tens of thousands of contributors to their Gitcoin grant, and there was a $1 contribution would give you $1,000 of matching. And I remember this went viral on crypto Twitter because there was these Bitcoin maximalists that were like, "This has to be a scam. How can you give $1 to this project and it's worth $1,000?" And it was actually like a really educational moment for them, for me to jump in and say, "No, it's actually based on this quadratic funding thing, and the math is actually really elegant." So that's quadratic funding. Basically, it's just a matching campaign where the number of contributors matters more than the amount that they contribute. Quadratic funding is really powerful. It's a way of engaging a community and doing a democratic funding of your Web3 ecosystem, but it's got two Achilles heels to it, and I just want to be completely upfront about that. The first Achilles heel is that you have to keep on topping up the matching pool. So basically, you have to find a way to continually set up that matching pool. So you either have to have a treasury that your ecosystem will find your tokens valuable, and or you have to find some way of outside fundraising the treasury. So that's Achilles heel one. The second Achilles heel of quadratic funding is that you need to find a way to prevent Sybil attacks. So Sybil attacks are basically the kind of situation that arises when if I'm going to give $10 to a project, well, I can do it under my identity and get a little bit of matching, or I can make up 10 sock puppet accounts in order to juice my contributions. And so making up identities is something that that is an attack vector of quadratic funding. And an adjacent and somewhat similar problem to making up identities is just paying people to contribute to your project. If my project was getting $100 matching on a $1 contribution, then it is it's plus EV for me to go out to all my friends and say, "Hey, contribute $1 to my project, and I'll give you each $5." So that's what's called a Sybil or a collusion attack. There are ways of solving both of those problems, and I'm happy to get into how Gitcoin did them if you and your audience are interested. But yeah, that's what quadratic funding is. Quadratic funding is just a matching campaign where the number of contributors matters more than the amount funded. And we funded about $60 million worth of funding for the Web3 and open source ecosystem, primarily using quadratic funding. Yeah, let me know what I missed or where you want to pinch and zoom.
So, you beat me to my question. You immediately went to the point, which was Achilles heel number two. I don't doubt that organizations that are interested in these types of problems would support and raising the matching pool, and that's a problem that's more so solved on a social level. But Achilles heel number two, which is Sybil attacks, is where I was like that the first time I heard about quadratic funding. I actually knew about Gitcoin Passport, and I'll let you explain that in a second. But I knew about it, but I didn't really piece the two together, and I think it's a very elegant solution. I think that it is a great problem solving approach to covering one issue with another piece of technology that serves multiple purposes. But could you talk a bit about Gitcoin Passport, how that works, and how this fits into the picture?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So the first thing I want to do is I want to set the stage and just say that Gitcoin is very evolutionary. Okay. So Gitcoin's evolved a lot over the 7 years. And in some way, I'm sort of like, I'm proud of how dogmatic we've been about we need to solve this mission, fund what matters. But I'm also proud of how pragmatic we've been in pivoting the tactics that we use to solve that mission. So pragmatism on the tactics and dogmatism on the mission. And we've run Gitcoin Grants launched in 2019, and we've run a quarterly round pretty much every quarter since 2019. So, do the math, it's the end of 2024, and we've been doing this since 2019. That's Gitcoin Grants 22 comes up in October of 2024. So this will be our 22nd Gitcoin grant round. And the thing that I try to do, and I think it was actually sort of like a bold and sort of revolutionary in some ways, is like I do not let perfection become the enemy of good. I think a lot of these projects will raise a bunch of money and do a big MVP launch, and no one comes or no one cares, or the product launch flops. And I've always been more of like an iterative shipper, and everything what we try to do with Gitcoin is just be better every round and solve the last round's problems in the next round's design. So the evolutionary frame, the iterative evolutionary frame, I think I just want to set the stage with that. But to actually answer your question, how do we deal with Sybil and collusion attacks around Gitcoin grants? 5 or 6, we started to see that Sybil attacks were becoming sort of a problem, or things that looked like Sybil attacks were becoming a problem, and we needed to come up with a way of solving that. And that the solution that we put together, which was basically verifying your identity on a couple different platforms in order to get a higher matching multiple, and unverified identities would get a lower matching multiple, and then eventually we phased out the unverified matching multiples at all. That solution became Gitcoin Passport. So Gitcoin Passport is just initially it was just a website in which you would go in and you could verify your identity on LinkedIn, on Facebook, which POAPs you held. So it was Web 2 and Web 3. Again, pragmatic on the tactics. We're not dogmatic that we can only use Web 3 data sources. And so it was just basically a bunch of stamps that you could put in your passport, and then your contributions could be verified when you had those stamps. Now, the first thing I want to say about this is that I'm pragmatic about the tactics, but not when it comes to privacy. We are not going to dox you. And from the very beginning of Gitcoin Passport, we've been very, very firm in that this needed to be, even though we're verifying more of a one human, one vote type of system, we didn't want to know which human you were. We just wanted to know that you weren't already on the registry of voters for a specific round. And so there's data architecture considerations there when you're verifying that, but you don't actually want to know what people's identities are. So this is not KYC. We do not want your name and address. We are not storing your identity document in a place where it can be doxed or hacked or anything like that. So that was Gitcoin Passport, and Gitcoin Passport has now evolved to become Passport.xyz. It's no longer a part of Gitcoin proper, although they've spun out, and if they ever do a token launch, I hope they decide to give contribution of tokens back to Gitcoin. And the one last thing I want to say about Passport is that people really hated having to verify their stamps. They're like, why the fuck do I have to do this? This is like a 30-minute side quest I just want to give to my favorite projects. And Passport in the last 5 or 6 rounds has been evolving to be a little bit more in the background. So basically, there's a lot of stuff that we can do with machine learning by looking at your wallet in the background to find out if you're a Sybil or a collusion attacker or not. And by doing more PhD level data science in the back, we don't have to interrupt your flow of contributing to the projects in order to verify that you're not a Sybil attacker. So yeah, round over round, just trying to get better. And, sometimes it's 1 step forward and 2 steps back because that's how these things work. But Passport has evolved a lot over the years, from no Sybil defense to just verifying identities to verifying identities with data science on the back end. And now Passport has spun out of Gitcoin, and Gitcoin grants is like Passport's 4th largest customer. There's a bunch of other tools that are using Gitcoin Passport, or I should now call it Passport.xyz, to verify the non-Sybilness of their users. And what that's what I want to say is this is why I think modular software is so cool, is because we built Passport to solve Gitcoin's own Sybil and collusion problems, and now it's out there solving a bunch of other Sybil problems out there. And that's the cool thing about modularity, is that it didn't have to be part of this like Gitcoin mega empire. Think about like Comcast or like NBC Universal or whatever. It's just a modular piece of software. And when it was no longer a core part of our mission and it had grown outside of Gitcoin, we let it go. And I think there's something beautiful about modular software and how it can operate with with other pieces of software, but also the idea that Passport could spin out of Gitcoin and could give tokens back to Gitcoin if and when it ever does a token generation event. So I think that there's a lot of learnings in beauty there. But yeah, Gitcoin Passport was our response to Sybil resistance problems, and happy to pinch and zoom on any of that if it's interesting to you or your audience.
So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. You're involved in a lot of different things, and I have two more questions that I want to tackle before I let you go. Um, you're an entrepreneur. You've been writing, and like from what I can see from 2010, you've written a lot of blog posts. A lot of them are really good. You've written or helped write My Coffee. You directed that, and you're currently working on a book that should be out in the next few months. You also run this organization, or at least are heavily involved in this organization, and you help a lot of different, companies and startups and open source projects. How do you allocate your time? How do you decide on what is important? Are there any lessons there that you feel apply beyond just allocating time and allocating capital?
Yeah. Um, Well, one of the things we've been debating in the writers group. I wrote this book called the On-Chain Capital Allocation Handbook. It's basically your guide to everything I've learned as a capital allocator in Web3. You can get it at allobook.gitcoin.co. But to actually answer your question, we've been debating in the writers group of the book whether we should change the name to the On-Chain Resource Allocation Handbook. And I think that there's something cool in going from thinking about, oh, we're not only allocating capital, but we're allocating our attention and we're allocating our labor to these things, and being intentional about that, and harnessing the swarm intelligence of the Web3 ecosystem. In doing that, I think is like there's something cool there. And I just love in my 20s, I was into professional development and quantified self and lifestyle design and all that kind of stuff. And there's something about taking the weird sort of analytical powers that I have in my like software development job and turning them on myself, and iterating on how I do things in the world. But yeah, how do I allocate my time, which is one of my most precious resources? I try to I try to put myself in places with people who give me energy and positive juju. I was just at MCon in Detroit, and lots of those people are DAO OGs and Web3 OGs. And one of the things that I've learned is that open spaces create open communication opportunities, create open research ideas. And so I've published 3 blog posts coming out of MCon of just like interesting conversations I had that I felt like were profound, and I wanted to broadcast them out to my audience. So yeah, just try to spend my time around interesting problems and interesting people. And if I'm going to be the person who's on the frontier, I want to broadcast the research learnings back to the people who don't have the opportunities and the access that I do. Through 7 years of running Gitcoin, I've gotten access to some really incredible people. I mean, Glenn Weil, Vitalik Buterin, my work is built on their work. Daniel Schmachtenberger has been a huge inspiration for me, Sri Ram from Eigenlayer. And the cool thing about being the Gitcoin founder is I can like slide into their DMs and ask them questions, and then like sometimes even write a research post with them. And so I just want to democratize that access and that knowledge. And it's not like this isn't like an altruism thing. This is also about decentralizing my knowledge so that I can decentralize Gitcoin. So there's sort of like a dogmatic belief in decentralization being good for core infrastructure, and when you want to leverage network intelligence that I'm doing here by writing these blog posts. I think if you go to gov.gitcoin.co, I've written 200 blog posts on the Gitcoin governance forum. So it's been a sort of a challenge in progressively decentralizing not only my role but my context and the access that I have. And I spend a lot of time on just trying to spread knowledge and make it into common knowledge from there. Now, that's a habit that I try to cultivate, but I think that my super weakness when it comes to time management is that I just say yes to too many things. I think that you never know where saying yes to something is going to lead to a new opportunity for you. And because of that, I DM with people across the ecosystem that I've never met, and sometimes they want me to read their blog post, and it's 20 pages long, wrong, and I use ChatGPT to get a TLDR of it, and I say yes to meetings that, and sometimes they don't work out, but sometimes they do. I spend probably 4 hours a day on calls, and that can really suck the energy out of you. And right after I take my calls, I go take a walk in nature so that I can reset my brain and my spirit to actually be focused on maker things and coding and writing after that. So yeah, I don't think that there's any one answer to how you manage your time, but the thing that you can always bring to your time management is mindfulness and sort of like a sense of play in that there's going to be seasons in your life and there's going to be seasons of projects that you work on, and what's right for one quarter or one season might not be right for the next quarter. And if you're mindful about it, if you track what you're doing, your output, your input, how you feel during it, does it bring you alive or does it take away energy, and you iterate from there, to thy own self you can be true, and you can iterate towards more prosperity and happiness and abundance, whatever that means to you. It could be financial abundance, it could be time abundance, it could be resource abundance, it could be abundance of intellectual problems that you're working on. And so this is what works for me, but I would just encourage listeners, if you're trying to be really intentional about your own time, and just know that the answer that other people have found is not the right answer for you. And I think that there's a continual process of being mindful of where your time and attention goes, and iterating from there. And I also think that like an important thing here is to give yourself some slack. Like, I'm terminally addicted to Twitter, and I probably spend 45 minutes per day on Twitter. And from there's some people who might say that's a complete waste of time, but I actually get a lot of alpha on Twitter, which is like new ideas and new relationships and new things from Twitter. And I try to think about whether or not I'm being intentional with my social media use. Am I actually getting something out of it, or am I just doom scrolling because I'm really tired and I'm like getting attention vampired by the AI that's trying to keep me on site on there? Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's a silver bullet. You just have to know yourself and to iterate and be mindful with how you spend your time and attention, and hopefully make better choices as time goes on.
Thank you for sharing that. So, my last question, and this is mainly inspired by reading your blog at Owocki.com. I've really enjoyed a lot of the pieces there. I really enjoyed information addiction. That's something that I struggle with. I'm constantly trying to consume information, and I think that, it's a double-edged sword. On one side, like I feel like I know a lot, but on the other side, like life isn't about being completely and utterly um obsessed with finding new stuff and efficient. So,
Yeah.
one thing I've noticed and that I respect a lot is your openness and your willingness to share information that could be, for somebody that's a founder. A lot of the times I see that they try to conceal parts of themselves or put on an image. I feel like you've been very open. Was that a process throughout your life that you've chosen to be more open with, or was there something that do you feel that drives you to keep being open?
Um, yeah, great question. I think that I just get a lot about being open as much as I can and sharing insights with people. And I think that for me, the it always just felt well. I think that there's an aspect of this that's generational, because I remember when I was like a Web 2 CTO, I took this older CTO out to lunch to like pick their brain about some problem I was having. I know some engineer, it wasn't working out and I didn't know what to do. And they were like, "Man, you share a lot on your blog. Like, I don't know if I would share that much." And like there's a generational thing here where like the younger generations are more open with their life, whereas the older generations are not. And maybe there's a generational thing here where I just like to share the things that have happened to me in my life. And one of the things that I've learned more and more is that like the experiences that I thought were unique to me, say like information addiction is a great example, they're not. There's other people that are experiencing them. It's just no one's talking about them. And it felt less lonely when I first connected with people about information addiction, or my interest in crypto, or really any of these things. And it just feels less lonely to know that you're not alone, and that in a lot of ways everything that we experience is the human condition, or at least the human condition in modernity. And then the other thing that I think is sort of happened in the last 10 years, which has been which has been really interesting to me. I was born in the early 80s. I don't know when your listeners were born. I tend to be in the like older cohort of crypto people, but when I was coming up in like my early 20s, all these websites just had this corporate speak on them that just felt completely hollow. And if you ever go to a website and they just have this like buzzword soup of like, we are like dedicated to the synergies of producing emergent outcomes of blah blah, like, and you're just like, this is completely just like corporate phony talk. I think that there's been a generational aversion to people that are just sort of like fluffing each other up and are phonies, for lack of a better word. And I think that part of that is like a trailing thing that's happened as we moved from broadcast media, where it's very hierarchical. If you have the TV network, you can broadcast to anyone's home and you can kind of make yourself look cool and popular. You're a celebrity. Many mainstream culture to this peer-to-peer internet culture where there's all these niches and micro celebrities. I think a thing that has happened in our culture is that we've gone from trying to seem perfect and like admirable and hiding all of our faults to just being open and real and moving away from the buzzword soup that I think was common like 20 or 30 years ago. And I just found that when I feel like someone's being honest with me and raw about what they really think, even if they disagree with me, even if they're being critical of me, I just respect that so much because the corporate BuzzFeed speak it just makes me disengage and shut down. And I think that rawness and realness is there's such a value to that. And it's actually not an easy thing because we're all these like walking narcissism machines that are trying to build our own personal brand and are trying to make a dent in the universe or whatever. And we're all also afraid of failing and appearing as flawed. And I think that what I've learned in the last 10 years, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'll fuck something up in 6 months and someone will use this quote against me or something like that. But again, it's about taking chances and taking risks. But I think that I think that if you're going to try to build something great, you can't be afraid of failure, or at least you have to know how to fail fast and recover from your failures. I remember when one of my friends was learning to ski. I moved out to Colorado a couple years ago, and I was telling my friend, I was like, it's not how many times you fall, it's about getting back up from the falls after you fuck something up. So when I fuck something up, I just try to own it and I try to recover fast from it. And like, I've like one of one of the things that always happens to me is like in social situations, I'll be talking too fast or I'll be too excited about what we're working on, and like someone will have to remind me like, hey man, keep your voice down a little bit, like indoor voice here. And like I always I guess like that's like an example of like a social ingrace I have from just from spending too much time on the computers. And I used to be like really like insecure about, oh my gosh, like that person corrected me, like are they my enemy now? And now I'm just like, yeah, like I'm imperfect, we're all imperfect, we're all trying to find compassionate ways to hold each other accountable. And I think that for me, it's kind of weird because it's kind of become like a personal brand thing for me, but personal branding sounds like it's this phony thing to me if you're trying to build a personal brand, whereas for me it was just kind of like setting out and following my instincts from the beginning. So yeah, I don't think that there's any right formula for everyone, but what's worked for me is just like moving fast, failing fast and moving fast and breaking things, and not being afraid of being imperfect in public. And that's created a lot of momentum, I think, around my work because I'm on the bleeding edge of things. And also if I'm wrong, like I'll respond to it and I'll correct it. And the other thing that comes to mind here is that my friend Zach Herring just sent a tweet today about his research process. He's a product researcher in the Web3 space, actually also out here in Colorado. And he was saying like too many people are trying to be perfect in their tweets. Like he was like, what you should do is be like what Owocki does, where like he has these throwaway tweets where he's looking to just like test out what his audience thinks of something. And he takes the best ideas and turns them into blog posts and then into books. Whereas the worst ideas, like no one fucking remembers because the algorithm downranks them. So Yeah, I don't know. It's all about figuring out how to be participant in this large network game that is Web3 and the invention of the future of the internet. And this is what I've found works for me, but other people are different. And you know, I'll be curious to hear from your listeners what works for them.
I really respect the philosophy of openness. I think it's something that a lot of people can learn from, and being vulnerable is only going to help you connect with people on a deeper level. Um, so, Kevin, thank you so much again for being here. I respect your time. I really appreciate you doing this. Is there anything that you want to leave this on?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that you and I have worked together on a couple different projects, and it's been fun to work with you and to see your talents as a software developer. And I think another cool thing is when people are multi-talented, there aren't a lot of people that do podcasting and software. So keep up the great work, and now subscribe to your podcast. And looking forward to seeing what you do next. And thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Kevin. I'll add all the links in the description. And yeah, hope we'll talk again.